Imagine an awkward boy who didn't make friends easily, alone in his room, long after his bedtime, his sheets pitched up like a tent. Underneath, the young boy trembles with fear of getting caught, knowing what humiliation might await. There he lay, hidden under the privacy of his own sheets, with at least some chance of hiding his secret shameful indulgence if anyone barged in without knocking. The air underneath the makeshift encampment doesn't circulate, so the sweat and increased breathing comes faster and faster, with just the normal anxiety of being up this late after bedtime doing this. Under those blankets, on his back, knees up to form that peak of the sheets, just so in case anyone comes in, what he's holding in his hands won't be obvious. He might have a chance of denial if caught, his hands in his lap, tightly clutching, wrapped around the girth of his Walkman. AM/FM radio, flimsy headphones barely over his ears, listening to the radical, zany, and borderline inappropriate night jock on, Zoom 103, Toledo's hot rock that really rocks. That young man's dreams of being the next Johnny Fever, knowing better than to booger up the broadcast, would be decimated, ruined to rubble in the media manifest destiny of deregulation. This episode is about how Bill Clinton killed the radio star, took the broadcast airwaves away from we the people, and handed them to greedy conglomerate corporate raiders, and how basically a handful of companies own everything you consume today thanks to Reagan and Clinton. Oh, and W. Bush, the one who drove a nail in the coffin of terrestrial radio. When some of us say both sides suck, some of us have done the work to know and why and just how that's true. Facts over feelings, kiddos. That boy under the sheets, by the way, wasn't me. I didn't have that radio influence as a kid. Most of my friends and former colleagues from my radio days had that experience. Music, radio, and that culture just weren't as much a part of my childhood. However, they could have been had my life not come down to one moment. One moment that should have influenced my life down the path of entertainment, but trauma got in the way, thrusting me on an alternate trajectory toward the same inevitable and probably predestined potential. In this episode, I'm talking more about my experience in radio, delving more into some of the events that shaped my career, but also the industry as a whole, how it changed, and how it bowed to capitalism run amok. You'll learn what influence Washington, specifically the Clinton and Bush II administrations, had on handing over the radio and television airwaves to the wealthiest of the wealthy, and more importantly, how that was the precedent for the internet, streaming, and social media. While it might be true that much of our entertainment landscape is the way it is today because some of those companies merged and grew and brought the standards of programming quality up, it's also true that much of our entertainment landscape is what it is today because someone allowed those companies to merge, swallow up smaller, locally owned media, conglomerate their media into all these chains and means of production, thus handing over regulation of the media and everything we consume from we the people and our elected representative government to gigantic, often multinational corporations whose sole goal is to increase profits for their shareholders and board members. Buy it up, strip what's valuable, scrap the rest, even people. That's the broadcasting industry in America in 1990. Television was different. Radio was accessible. Once upon a time, the dreams of being the guy talking into that microphone for thousands of people, millions if you're syndicated, died with the medium that failed to evolve with the times. We're going to discuss the inevitable death of terrestrial radio's relevance, and in its eulogy, maybe we can learn how it might have survived had it not sold its soul to corporate greed and unabashed hubris, while allowing men with egos the size of their Scrooge McDuck money silos to dictate the audience's wants and needs. Remember, the secret to success is convincing people of what they want and reminding them over and over, you are the only one who can provide it. In Raiders of the Lost Art, it's Radio Gaga, Radio Blah Blah, Radio What's New, Radio Why We Stopped Listening to You. This is the answer. You couldn't answer that question or the request line. You piped in pre-programmed personalities and told the people we like listening to talk less, be less, and make less, work more, make nothing. This is a sad, suicidal story of an industry that once led the way for entertainment, provided the way for many young talent, provided the foundation for much of what we know of media today, but outlived its relevance, clinging on to life for the hopes that the next generation of radio personalities will somehow not realize they can do everything they ever wanted to on radio and more, and make more money on Spotify, YouTube, Twitch, TikTok, Instagram. Look, times they are a-changing, but if you ask radio, it's still 1989, baby. Oh, and if you thought the beginning of this was something dirty, you're the pervert, not me. As my daddy always told me, you're perverted if you use the feather. You're a pervert if you use the whole chicken. That's a joke I shouldn't tell, but can tell on mass media, thanks to Bill Clinton. And welcome to the podcast. My relationship with broadcasting and entertainment was established early, possibly predetermined. But as a child, moving around and going back and forth from my dad to my mom and back to my dad, I didn't grow this close connection with music. In fact, psychologically, I had a few songs I realized once I started programming country radio that were deep-rooted emotional triggers from a traumatic period of my childhood. I traced the timelines of these songs' popularity, knowing what I know of airplay trends on radio, thanks to my professional experience. I realized that these songs were hits on the radio when the radio was on, when I was growing up during this part of my life, when I was being pulled between parents in a vicious custody battle I've previously discussed. Those songs at that time would have been in what we call a power rotation, the most played songs that test the best with the research, or the ones the record label or consultant paid you to play the most, but one way or the other. You see, payola was made illegal. That meant radio stations couldn't take compensation for playing music. That's just unfair, right? So record labels started paying consultants to tell radio stations what to play, and radio stations paid consultants to tell them what to play. It was called research. Brilliant strategy, if you ask me. Now, here's the interesting twist to a story I'll explain more in depth toward the finale of this season. Because of this trauma and my general and historical disconnection with things that tend to trend, I just didn't grow up a music person. I don't remember many songs outside of TV theme songs and those pop hits that stand out. I enjoyed Michael Jackson's music, but who didn't? I wasn't a fan of anybody. I didn't go deep into the library. It was Beat It, Billie Jean, and bad. Thriller never came on MTV because it was too long. Madonna made me uncomfortable because it ignited a femininity in me I wasn't allowed to understand. Hell, if anything, I liked Weird Al Yankovic, my very first concert. But music fandom just wasn't my personality profile. I liked a lot of things growing up, but music was put on. It's how I acted human. People around me liked music. I either liked that music or I didn't. I didn't fake liking music. It's just that I didn't expose myself to a lot of music. It was exposed to me, and then I went, oh, well, that's got a groovy beat. I was on Queen way before Wayne's World. It was Highlander for me, Princess of the Universe, Who Wants to Live Forever. So many brilliant songs on that soundtrack. I had friends that introduced me to Pearl Jam and grunge music, which resonated more with me, but even that fandom was more related to learning about the music for my career in radio than being a fanboy. But that was high school, and by that point, there just weren't radio stations in the small town I lived in, and radio as a cultural thing from my childhood was a local AM station reading obituaries, police reports, and usually straight from the scanner, and of course Swap and Shop. It was horrible quality, but vital to the community. I didn't get the big city whiz-bang in-your-face top-quality listening experience growing up. Until I lived with my mom for a bit in Nashville. I remember she listened to the radio and was really into country music. Getting ready for school with her, the Music City stations would be cranking out the country, and from the Judds to George Strait in Alabama to the mid to late 80s, they had the hits. In fact, if you search Definitive on my Spotify playlist, you'll find a hosted playlist which features a lot of those songs that were definitive of that era. Some of those songs, for whatever reason, played so much they became the trauma triggers that would send me into a blocked memory panic attack, where the key to that door is A flat and a steel guitar. The long locked door flies open and slap right in the face with whatever monster was hiding behind it. For me, it was a lot of pain, agony, feelings I've since processed, but they weren't good feelings. Hearing Why Not Me by the Judds sent me into a spiral akin to a dramatic meltdown you'd see on television. A girlfriend played it for me once in high school without either of us knowing, and I simply zoned out, disassociated. It kind of scared her. She had to snap me back to reality, and I had to abruptly ask her to cut the song off. Unresolved trauma. Had nothing to do with the song. It was the trauma left unresolved, period. That song was just the soundtrack to that sadness. Resolving the trauma leaves the song to elicit a memory rather than a breakdown. This is why I believe I didn't have the connection to music or radio the way many of my industry mates might have mentioned. I was young when I closed myself off to feeling music. Well, other than the Willy Wonka soundtrack. The first album I owned that was mine was a mixtape compilation heavy metal tape that I had sort of picked up at a record store. It had songs I didn't even like. However, everybody in my circle talked about bands with funny sounding names. Def Leppard, Quiet Riot. Well, their songs were spelled funny, so I asked my dad why they spelled Come On Feel the Noise that way, and he slapped me. And when I tried to draw Def Leppard, the logo for that on one of my folders, the kid who sometimes befriended me, sometimes bullied me, asked, "What's a Def Leopard?" Despite how their music sounded to me at the time, they weren't hearing impaired jungle cats, as it turns out. Quite embarrassing. I was just drawing the font. It wasn't in me to misspell things, even in 7th grade. My relationship with radio, I feel like, was bound to happen. If I'd stayed with my mom, I would have undoubtedly been influenced not only by her environment and personality, but by her belief in me. My mother believed in my comedy skills as a young man so much, she bought me a camcorder, begged me to record myself on stage, and she'd send my tape to Lorne Michaels, and I'd get on SNL. Imagine me growing up with that kind of support system all the time. How could she give me up, send me back to my dad to live in Hicktown hell of a vacuum of thought, inspiration, and opportunity? Well, I've discussed that before. Mom and I are good. Without the sad what ifs and whys, let's discuss the reality of probability. If I went to small-town rural Tennessee with my dad, who probably always dreamed of being funny on a bigger platform than at the Meet and Three, but never took the shot, and I still landed in radio, then it stands to some reason that if I stayed with my mom, as connected as she was to people in the music industry, as many people as she and my sister and my uncles knew, that if I had found an interest in performing on broadcast media, I could have had some doors open for me in Nashville growing up that opened sort of on their own, living with my dad. It was almost like the universe took me out of the influence of the toxic white Southern culture of my father's and put me into the hands of my mother, a decade older sister, a close grandmother, a gay uncle, not to mention a brother who might have lived had I stayed with them. I know. That's a stretch of reality, survivor's remorse, guilt, whatever, but we're talking probabilities, not possible outcomes. The math, which I suck at, would suggest, and I'm making this up, that statistically speaking, in the nature of flipping coins enough times it's not 50-50, then the probability is at least one of the possible outcomes could be that my staying with my mom instead of going back to my dad might have saved my brother's life, changing the course of every event after. It might have cost my dad his life, drowning his sorrows, having lost everything. I might have succumbed to some bad influence in a bigger city, namely my brother. The possibilities back up the probabilities. The higher likelihood of universal influence is that my destiny in an entertainment career, specifically in country music radio, would have been most likely with my mom. Still, I went back to my dad at 10 years old, bounced around until we landed in that small southern town where I lived for 7 years. Just 7, long enough to start high school, finish, go to community college, and begin my broadcasting career, and then transfer out. 7 years, 14 to 21 years old, 1990 to 1997. This period of time was crucial for me and the radio industry as a whole. I wasn't all that aware of radio before I got into radio. Had I stayed with my mother, that absolutely would not have been the case. My brother and sister have vivid and fond memories tied to Nashville and even the local radio stations where we grew up in the 1980s and early 90s. Nashville radio in that era was pretty cutting edge. I mean, it is, after all, Music Row, Music City, all the country record labels, most of the artists and everything that is country, it's Nashville. I don't live in regretful or whimsical what-ifs. This is merely setting the stage for my relationship to the subject. You see, my relationship to the subject and the abrupt end to that relationship, I believe, is a perfect example of the death of terrestrial radio. I'll get into a lot more of the specifics of my career as we wind this season down. It's to say that I got into radio at a time when great change was on the horizon. Had my career begun 5 years sooner, I might have weathered the storm. Not that I wanted to or would have, but I might have had more at stake career-wise. What I see today are many in the industry fighting hard to remain relevant in a swelling storm of swirling social media and similar systems of content consumption. To simplify this without spoiling the episode, radio can't compete in the instant gratification era where every other option offers the instant gratification radio can't. Many are out there doing good work for their communities and will be the last bastion of communication and connection should our society ever fall or have a major critical crisis. What I also see are many falling prey to detrimental trends, so desperate to remain relevant they're willing to say, play, and do whatever it takes to keep their audience captured. Back to that phenomenon of audience capture I discussed around social media. This is true for any type of content, any type of media. One of my favorite Kiss songs was one on Gene Simmons' solo album. First off, before I knew what he was, Gene Simmons' Kiss Demon was cool as all hell. All of Kiss was. But the only song I really liked was his version of When You Wish Upon a Star. The Disney song, Jiminy Cricket, I loved it. I wore that track out. The rest of the album, In fact, most of my disinterest in Kiss comes from a really bad radio boss who was obsessed with them and made them a quarter of his entire personality. And the fact that one song that I liked was nothing like any of the rest of their songs. Now, had they been interested in me as a fan, knowing that song hooked me, maybe they'd do lots of Disney covers or show tunes. Seriously, how did my dad not know? Audience capture is where you do the thing and the people respond to it. So you're stuck doing the thing to keep them responding. But you do anything but that thing, they don't want that. They want the thing. You now need that rush of validation, and that thing is the only way to get it. Audience capture. So many artists put out a duet or some different style of music, and it's flat out rejected by a chunk of their audience. That's one way you can spot someone capable of falling prey to the negative type of cultism I talk about in this series. We hear and talk about the media, and understand I've been the media in some fashion or another since I was around 19 years old. I started in TV news for a small local cable access channel. Nothing impressive. I then transitioned to radio, realizing relevance didn't demand revelation. I could hide behind the microphone and still do what I did. TV exposed me and put my face everywhere. People recognized me and talked to me, or worse, they didn't. They stared or pointed. And this is small scale, folks, but I got a peek at it and knew what I liked and knew what I didn't. So I refocused on radio. I've done just about everything you can imagine outside of way upper management. My perspective is pretty deep. What I've seen and experienced is representative of the arrogance and hubris of an industry that was warned for 2 decades it would eventually be irrelevant, and denied that inevitable truth while technology, the entire media industry, and the audience they were trying to capture got the message and passed them by. I started my career in the mid-90s. By 2000, the gears had shifted. Then as the Bush economy imploded in 2007, those gears locked and we threw a rod. By the time radio rebounded in the mid-2010s, I'd be out of the industry for good, and the comeback for terrestrial radio would be short-lived. What radio as an industry didn't see is what I failed to see while I was in it, and now see I couldn't see until I wasn't in it. Outside looking in perspective, part of big picture first thinking. There would come a day when the accessibility of the means of mass communication would revert back to we the people. I saw the coming horizon of conglomeration, consultation, and corruption. The corporate greed of some of the biggest media companies you've ever heard of. And the open floodgates of pro-big business legislation from Washington raged through the small towns, the counties, and the communities of rural middle America, making the deals so sweet no mom and pop could resist. And when Big Brother came to town to buy the little radio station, they bought the billboards, the newspaper, the ad agency, the TV station, and everything they could legally buy. Which before they couldn't legally buy because regulations were in place to prevent one company from owning it all. Because, what sense would that make? What good would come of that? This episode isn't about conspiracy theories, that the stage was set for men like Rupert Murdoch to buy up a bunch of media outlets and pre-write conservative America's personality narrative for decades. We aren't going to talk about who got rich from all this deregulation, are we? That, for a voice actor who still does work for lots of clients, would be career suicide, wouldn't it? This episode really isn't even about the lack of foresight by an industry run by mostly wealthy white men who failed to see the world around them was evolving beyond their archaic insistence that they be the gatekeepers for what people see, hear, and think. When it came to my radio career, I was good at what I did. What I wasn't good at back then is what I'm not good at now. It was detrimental to my career then and it is costing me dearly today. I don't manage myself well. As a one-man show, I struggle with writing, producing, creating content, marketing, advertising, writing books, and making music, and everything it takes to be bigger than you are. Beyond that, I don't have anyone beside me saying, "Hey Josh, you maybe want to lighten up the tone a bit." It's just me and my filter, not filtering much, as I say. The major problem with our society today is just that. Everyone is me, and everyone with minimal investment and zero training can have their own live streaming platform on one of the most popular social media platforms. You can do it on any platform you choose. You can just be a person with an opinion and everybody gets to hear it. You no longer have to apply to work at the radio station, earn your stripes, pay your dues, lugging tents, tubs of t-shirts, and trunks of equipment from car dealership to fair, nor do you have the training, mentorship, or understanding of the responsibility of broadcast media. Hence my book, Influence, by Josh Brandon. All you have to do to be heard today is push a button and speak. All you have to do to have an opinion is to get one from somewhere. This episode isn't about freedom of speech either, or our collective misunderstanding of that principle. This is more about an industry of abuse and arrogance and the narcissistic nonsense of heeding the very clear warnings every step of the way. The problem is radio always won. Every time radio was on the ropes, they came back. The problem with that comeback is that there was never a clear way to gauge the rise and fall of radio. Radio had sort of regulated the way they were rated all along, their rules. TV had Nielsen, radio had Arbitron. The parameters and benchmarks of success were subjective and open to interpretation, mostly by the sales departments. Radio sets those standards and defined their own success. Now, my specific skill set was spitting shit into shine. I could take the statistical data, extrapolate any number of detailed cross-sections of our demographic and sometimes even psychographic, P1s, first preference listeners, like our die-hard loyal fans, and cast any number of narratives with those breakdowns. Radio, as an industry, did just that. Just like all of media, you must read beyond the headlines. While ratings might have dipped down or ticked up here and there, overall radio listenership, the people who are listening to the radio, the number of individuals who still feel radio is the place for whatever, has plummeted. The collective audience that radio has to pitch to any given advertiser is so insignificant in light of evolving multimedia and internet trends. The only way a radio station can survive is if they branch out and offer non-traditional revenue stream services like web ads. Radio doesn't even believe in radio anymore. They know their airtime is worthless to advertisers who need people to listen to the commercial closely and pay attention to every word in that 30 seconds of post-pharmaceutical ad fast talk instead of turning to another source of entertainment that doesn't have commercials at all, or even if they do, they can skip them after 5 seconds. My radio career ended unceremoniously with me being so disgusted and disheartened by my treatment and the treatment I saw others receive, but the treatment that I saw inflicted upon many of the brilliant women I knew in the industry. I don't mean this as any kind of performative savior comment. It's not like I said, "This industry is bad to women and I quit." It was that this industry had been horrible to me and I quit. And it had been so horrible to so many others, most of which I didn't fully realize or accept until I got out of that abusive, narcissistic relationship. It's that along the way, the rampant sexism, racism, classism, corruption, and sociopathic ineptitude of almost everyone I worked for led me to believe that the industry was rotten at its core. After all, if that was what the curdled cream that rose to the top there of that industry, why would I want to be included in that hall of shame? There was a cancer of arrogance and hubris fed by toxic masculinity and greed that closed itself off to any outside influence of forewarning. Instead of choosing to listen, they chose to devour themselves in their own self-fulfilled prophecy of suicidal surrender. Then, years after I hung up my headphones, I began my journey of deconstruction and this cultural exploration of overthinking everything. And then I realized there was a dark similarity in my path through broadcasting that mirrored many facets of fascism. What I began to see is that America has sort of a corporate fascist ideology that economically benefits from a corporate socialism for which we, the working class, foot the bill. Many say socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor, but that's not really accurate. Examining what the United States government did to deregulate the media, starting in 1981 with Reagan through the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and on to selling out the broadcast industry in 2007, we can see at least one narrative: that Washington wanted to seize the means of communication for the wealthiest of the wealthy to prevent this fear they had of what we're seeing from them over TikTok. We the people, connected and talking about what Washington is doing. At least one narrative exists where both parties conspired, again, against the American working class. This time, to open the legislative floodgates, rolling back those regulations that kept our media in check and in the hands of we the people. All in an effort to homogenize, dilute, and centralize America's collective thought processes. That's just silly, though, isn't it? Come on! Surely it was all about money. Right? Radio in the mid-90s, when I first started, was still riding that relevance wave of grunge-era rock. The 90s transition from Conway to Clint Black and the good old boys to Garth. The pop of the 90s was this homogenized hybrid of many formats, as it always has been, but the 90s formats were expanding and growing. So was pop. Music radio was relevant, more than it ever would be again. The internet wasn't as accessible then. Though most had it, connection speed wasn't where we could do much with it but edge ourselves until the video loaded. Then the Telecommunications Act, as I've detailed before, came along and rewrote the rules of radio. Rewrote the entire DNA of terrestrial radio. While the greediest of the media moguls chuckled at what they had done, invested in campaign donations on candidates they knew would support their ideas, manipulating our legislative branch to their whims so that these pesky rules that kept media companies from growing too big for their britches could be struck down and companies could merge and grow and buy every small market station and move it to a much bigger nearby city. What the media giants knew before anyone else was exactly what their audience would tolerate. These media giants knew these communities wouldn't fight back. They would lay down, bend, and let corporate America, the free market, do whatever they wanted. You see, in many of these rural areas, you had hardworking, blue-collar, salt-of-the-earth kind of folks, right? Who had been gaslit and brainwashed against workers' rights and unions. Those rights are the rights not just in the workplace, but for the working class. They'd been told to think and what to think for nearly 2 decades already. The kids were fully enraged with pester power thanks to Reagan's unleashing of the children's programming restriction floodgates. America was for sale if you had the money. If you didn't, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and try harder, sonny. Local radio was sold out to the highest bidder, with small station owners or their descendants cashing in on lucrative offers they couldn't refuse, retiring and moving on while Big Brother shows up, auctions off anything of value they can't use, and donates the rest. They take the equipment they can use and move it to the next biggest market where they can capitalize on ad dollars. That deregulation not only opened up media ownership rules, but it also loosened the regulations on where a station could be. These stations are on a spectrum, and they're set up so that they don't interfere with one another. 98.5 here can't be too powerful or it'll bleed over 98.5 there. So we have lots of things to consider. The answer was to leave those radio towers where they were or move them as close to the money pot of advertisers as legally and technically possible. The offices and studios could go anywhere after deregulation. Communities lost their radio stations. Communities across America lost their voice, and those voices were replaced by Rush Limbaugh and Fox News Radio, as well as other largely conservative syndicated programming options. I joke often that you never really saw a lot of successful left-leaning political talk radio because leftists don't need to be told how to think. That's not far from the truth. The coming storm of irrelevance for radio was imminent. While many wouldn't admit it, I believe the fat cats at big radio saw a shift, as did many of the small station owners, even if they weren't altogether right about what the shift would be exactly. Many of them probably sold out at least partly because of the changing horizon of advertising. More choices for the entertainment meant lower ratings and fewer total listeners. With portable music's technological advancements and the digital developments of crystal clear CD quality sound on the go, many radio station owners might have felt the strain of the previous decade's industry tech progress. Within a decade, terrestrial radio had gone from records to carts, which were glorified 8-track cassettes you played out of these clunky rectangular boxes with big chunky buttons. Then, those were used mostly just for commercials in radio, while stations switched to playing music from CDs. Then similar cart player devices were created for CDs with these nice little cases you could put the disc into, keep it safe from scratches. Then automation became the standard. Some stations still had vinyl turntables in their studios when installers came to put in the latest computer automation software. Many of those in radio were still splicing reel-to-reel tape with razor blades and grease pencils when Adobe Audition's 23andMe Cool Edit was first released. Many of those companies had payment and installment plans or deals worked out where they sold the station the hardware, then licensed the software as a barter deal. You gave them X number of minutes of ad time a week, and that company then had a sales division that sold ads. Still, a small station running swap and shop and ads for the meat and three with obituaries every morning, forking over hundreds of thousands of dollars in upgrades just to keep up, might have been too much for some station owners to swallow. Then as the industry tech advanced, so advances the consumer tech. If we can create digital playlists that automatically play, then why can't our listeners? Those radio alternative options not playing commercials or doing the things people disliked about radio would be a death knell. After all, radio being such a wasteland of jock talk and commercials for the same 100 songs in rotation worked when they were the only game in town. MTV changed the game for a while, but they weren't portable. Radio got arrogant. Radio got cocky. Even talk radio slashed their talent budgets because they could charge more for Rush Limbaugh in primetime than they could for a market legend and radio station lifer Stormin' Steve Taylor on the afternoon drive home. Radio's heyday of promising pay and behind-the-scenes perks was winding down. Greed was settling in, and the powers that be saw the cash cow dollar signs on the rapidly advancing horizon. With technology advancing and opportunities for expanding, radio station owners had to look at cutting costs somewhere, didn't they? Syndicated talent like Rush Limbaugh or the 7 to Midnight All Request Party show might have cost your station airtime, but they didn't cost a salary and insurance benefits either. The airtime they cost was airtime your revolving door sales department couldn't sell anyway. Salaries stagnated and staffs were slashed. Stations were relocated, reformatted, and pre-recorded, with programming and all of the music and none of the cost. Stations who employed a couple dozen people then went to employ half that, maybe. 2 or 3 would be lucky to get signed with Big Brother when mom and pop sold that station. Times, for broadcasters, they were a-changin'. The 1990s began with a slow and largely unnoticeable deregulation of media ownership rules, which protected communities from having one media company having what amounts to a monopoly in any given area. If there were 10 radio stations, 4 TV stations, and 2 newspapers, one company couldn't own even a third of it. Once those restrictions were lifted, companies began swallowing up those smaller stations whole. Some might argue that the local stations would have eventually folded, and the corporate raiders would have swept in to dominate and homogenize the industry one way or another. I might agree with that. We'll never know. Radio was too caught up in their own arrogance and hubris to notice the emerging trends and technologies or acknowledge how critical they might be to their own future. That's kind of radio's story, though, isn't it? Radio didn't seem to get it when FM was starting to take off. Those AM radio loyalists just wouldn't accept frequency modulation. Most couldn't tell the difference scientifically, and even though FM sounded better, many wouldn't embrace the progress. They were wrong. FM was the new wave, and many of those old dogs who were wrong went on to become those bitter industry veterans who never made it, complaining on local message boards about the popular new personalities living those dreams radio squashed for them. That was the stereotype. Then as music became more portable, radio still wasn't concerned. Walkmans were the way people could listen on the go. So a plus for radio, right? When they started playing tapes, well, that's giving people too much choice, right? As records evolved to tapes and tapes evolved to CDs, the personal portable equivalent of AM to FM, music nerds brought back vinyl because crisp, clear digital sound was just too much. We miss those static crackle imperfections, don't we? Still, radio gave no concern for portable music. After all, they're CDs with 12 songs and radio has libraries of music. Then, so did we. Radio, seeing the MP3 player on the horizon, should have had an emergency conference of the greatest minds of the industry to address that technological monsoon. Hey, we've watered down our funny and relatable personalities to the point that they're just annoying, glorified live commercials saying nothing, and we're breaking for 2 songs worth of commercials between songs. So like when someone has a device the size of their car's key fob and it's loaded with 5 times our playlist rotation, why would anyone in their right mind subject themselves to radio? Yet there I was, midway through my career, seeing my listeners build their own pocket playlists, knowing something had to be done while recognizing nothing could be done. I knew this train wouldn't run forever. I just wasn't ready for it to go off the tracks as soon as it was into my time on the ride. Satellite radio launched into relevance with Howard Stern's defection from the broadcast tower to the orbital antenna. Stern had been one of the biggest celebrities in radio and entertainment. His book, Private Parts, was essential reading, and the movie made that was based off that book was entertaining. Pretty revealing. I saw a lot of similarities and relatability in the story. Stern was always too much for me, but I had been through enough of pushing boundaries that way in college, so early on I began formulating my respect for the broadcast airwaves ideology. I saw the boundaries of acceptability being pushed, and I didn't want to be on that train. I wanted to have fun, make jokes, push the boundaries, but I didn't want to be the one who pushed the boundary that far as a norm. Still, Stern's prowess as a personality was incomparable. When SiriusXM merged, landed Stern, and started being available by default in every manufactured stereo system, the game changed. When most AM/FM devices also offered SiriusXM, boy, that was it. It wasn't even satellite. The SiriusXM logo featured prominently, great branding. Terrestrial radio didn't have that kind of power. AM/FM, a bunch of disconnected, random, and scattered stations. A default name that groups in every station on the spectrum into 4 letters and a slash. Meanwhile, Sirius/XM was putting its foothold everywhere. Commercial-free. Many stations didn't have jocks, no personalities. The music was the personality. The personalities they did have were often tight, polished, relaxed, without selling you something other than another cool station or show. The only difference between AM/FM and satellite? Subscription. Well, in the early days, it was finding a device which would receive the signal. The company rectified that, as I mentioned, so now the only thing was getting people to fork over. Well, whatever that number would be. Sounds easy enough, right? Satellite CD Radio, SiriusXM's maiden name, was founded in 1990 in Washington. I know you'd think Seattle would be the place for something hip like that, wouldn't you? No, the District of Columbia. Why DC? Well, this was a new company capitalizing on new technology. The AM/FM spectrum of radio broadcast waves was reserved for, well, radio. This company planted their roots in DC to lobby Congress to bend to their will. They wanted to join the game. Representatives of districts and senators of states, which are people representing people, including the owners of small, rural, local radio stations, sold out those constituents for big business. There's no other way to look at it. Reaganomics. The free market demands tribute. The fact is, satellite radio wasn't a thing until it was a thing. It never had to be a thing until Congress made it a thing. The free market argument is that if the tech is available and ready for the public's consumption, then the public has a right to it, yes? except that terrestrial radio had been sacred in this country to some extent. In times of emergency, radio was often all you had. TVs weren't battery operated. When the power went out and the roof got blown off, you were huddled in the basement with radio. Local radio. Local radio saves lives. Still to this day. While this episode might seem like a condemnation on radio, understand that I believe broadcast radio is vital and essential to a community. When the shit hits, radio will be one of the last technologies to fail, save a mass EMP attack. But then most of us are fucked anyway, right? The thing about the free market isn't that it isn't a free market. There's no such thing as a fair market value in a capitalist and greed-driven society. So, these local radio station owners, their employees, and the many in their respective communities they served, the constituents of those in Congress, voted for their representatives to go to Washington and defend their best interests. Their best interests were their jobs, their communities, and their industry. But when faced with large donations and a platform not so much regulated by the FCC, which would platform their views and the views of their friends, those in Washington sold out their constituents. Follow the money. The early 2000s was contentious between terrestrial radio and satellite, and the debate on the terminal implications of allowing that technology to be commercially available. Isn't this the case with almost everything? Didn't we see theater attendance dip when you could stay home and listen to radio plays? And people listened to those less when movies came out. And when television launched, boy, who went to a play anymore? Why go to a movie when you can curl up on the couch and watch TV together? So, it's progress versus traditionalism, again. Except this time, the progress in question would put an inevitable death sentence on its predecessor. And in this case, its predecessor was a far more valuable and important to the bigger picture, to the people, to the country, than this cash cow for-profit corporate owned from who knows where with what agenda replacement. By 1997, the satellite radio industry was created. Sirius and XM were separate companies back then, competitors in this new space because capitalism demands tribute. XM, the oldest twin, Sirius, the flashier, slightly younger twin. XM's origins date back to the late 80s, while Sirius was born in 1990. These two companies were neck and neck in the race. Sirius was the first to ask Congress for access to the frequencies, while XM was a pioneer in the device side of the technology. Neither was exclusive to their foothold in any specific area, nipping at each other's heels the entire time. The timeline goes, XM was developing the technology in other areas. Sirius filed petitions with the FCC for the tech to even be on the table. Once Sirius did that, XM jumped in the game immediately. Sirius landed Chrysler, Ford, and BMW. XM had Toyota, Honda, and GM. Brand loyalty inception. Pick your car brand, and then you're kind of sucked into the cultism of whichever brand your satellite radio car manufacturer partnered with. Capitalism. You have no choice unless you choose a different car brand. XM debuted after a 2-week postponement of their launch date due to the World Trade Center attacks. Sirius would launch a few months later on Valentine's Day of 2002. A near simultaneous launch of these two competitors in the satellite radio space made for a fun little game to watch. Who would win? But these were premium subscription-based channels, and nobody in the terrestrial radio space took them seriously at first. There were Chicken Littles, sure. I was one. But we were shushed quickly and our concerns dismissed. When I would make statements about how radio was diluting itself of what set them apart from any competition, I was branded as negative. And well, in radio, let me just say nobody likes the consultant. But if you say you have an issue with consultants, you might as well speak heresy in church. I can respect someone's knowledge, experience, and even take their advice while also understanding they don't always need to exist and they help destroy the industry. Still, those floodgates of deregulation wouldn't be the last time our elected representatives sold out the radio broadcasting industry. The early 2000s was an atypical era for America. It was post 9/11, and America's collective attitude was much different than before. Terrestrial radio rode the wave of, when this happened, we were first with the news you need by the people you trust. Talk 7:50 a.m. Tell them what they want and remind them over and over and over again you're the one who gave it to them and everyone else is garbage. By the mid-2000s, the writing was on the wall. Satellite radio was going to fold and go the way of minidisc, and terrestrial radio would reign supreme. Or satellite radio would have to combine forces, realizing that there wasn't room in this town for both of them. Both companies were struggling. Neither had made a profit. Both weren't reaching subscriber projections. $12.95 got you seemingly unlimited options. Look, if you loved when your local classic rock station did a block party weekend jamming back-to-back triple shots of your favorite rock that really rocks on these stations, satellite stations, you could get any number of options and stations dedicated entirely to specific artists. Imagine what they could do if they combined resources. In 2007, rumors swirled and were later confirmed of just that: the arranged marriage of Sirius and XM. Despite their constituents' disapproval and the National Association of Broadcasters' warnings of an industry monopoly and the attorney generals for 11 states raising concerns, along with a slew of congressional Democrats, the Bush administration and the Justice Department greenlit the merger in 2008. 2008. The same year, Bush II, the lame duck president, was set to ride off into the sunset and leave America to the maverick John McCain and his daft bimbo blowhard Sarah Palin. The same year, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were also in the political mix. The technology and industry of satellite radio should have folded, plain and simple. That was big business capitalism, risk and reward. They tried it, they rolled the dice, they failed, they projected big to get the funding, then failed to deliver, miserably. And the Bush administration bailed them out, annihilating local radio in the process. It took 57 weeks for Washington to drive the nail into terrestrial radio's coffin. All the while, at conferences and seminars and conference calls and closed-door meetings, radio executives, managers, programmers, and consultants agonized over how to survive satellite radio. I say agonized, but more like sat back, cashed their short-sighted checks, and made off like bandits with no regard for the long game. Radio didn't take satellite seriously as competition. Or maybe the argument is they did, but focused too much on satellite without acknowledging the weaknesses in terrestrial radio that satellite radio, forgive me, amplified. It would be those weaknesses that would be the undoing of both terrestrial and satellite radio. What's clear is the arrogance of assuming someone wouldn't pay $13 a month to never have to hear your annoying car dealership client's annoying ad ever again. SiriusXM overestimated just how many people would defect from free but annoyingly poor listener quality local radio to ad-free top-tier talent subscriber status satellite radio. Again, the tech was new and older devices wouldn't work. I'm sure that and the shitty Bush economy wouldn't help those figures. The merger ended the conversation. What the merger didn't do was end terrestrial radio. The fact is, no technology that's come along has sunk the radio ship, and I'm not sure what technology would. Unlike satellite radio, terrestrial radio should exist. And that isn't to say that satellite radio shouldn't exist, it's just that it failed. Both Sirius and XM should have been allowed to fold, and the technology then reassessed for greater good and best uses for the public commercial use, the way radio and television were. Instead, Bill Clinton gave the dog the rabies, while George W. Bush's administration put terrestrial radio down like Old Yeller. Corporate raiders and Clinton killed the radio star. Sure. But it was Bush, too, who slammed the door shut on the comeback. You see, if you follow the money, you can see that some were gifted with the foresight of insider trading. You can see that some managed to weather that storm. The one of corporate conglomeration and corruption. When fewer than a handful of companies own a majority of the media in this country, and it's owed to our elected officials, and it wasn't in the greater good of we the people, then we owe it to ourselves to revisit the why that happened. We know why. Money, power. Big radio might have seen satellite on the horizon, but their gross underestimations of the impact of the internet, streaming, personal playlist players, and everything after satellite radio is what thrust the radio industry into pop culture obscurity. In my radio days, I learned all about the ratings. Your P1 listener, as I've mentioned, is a first preference listener. You are number one to them. P2s, P3s, P4s, and so on. There comes a point where it didn't matter. If you were someone's fourth choice, that person isn't your listener. You're their last resort, Papa Roach. Radio lost a lot of P1s through the various erosions of listenership along each instance of commercial technology progress. Radio listenership hasn't grown since satellite radio. The number of people who might reference "I heard it on the radio" are fewer and fewer. May not even be the radio. When was the last time anyone you know brought up a local radio station or talent in a conversation about anything cool? In fact, terrestrial radio lost a lot of overall listeners they couldn't hope to get back now. What's worse, today you add actual music streaming services, video streaming services, internet radio, podcasts, playlists, and everything out there today. 1996, when I first got into radio, it's a wonder radio survived this long. The radio industry's arrogance failed to adequately prepare for each wave of irrelevancy. For the hardware and software tech leaps within the industry to those same leaps in the consumer space, radio failed over and over for years and then realized they weren't the cool kid in school anymore. They were the 23-year-old senior who never seemed to get it enough to graduate and thought everybody liked him when it was just his access to the liquor store. Metaphorically speaking. Backstage passes to the Taylor Swift concert, more likely. Washington's greed and disregard for we the people and our means of mass communication created the cultism cancer of misinformation and personality politics that has eaten away at America's heartland. Today, you needn't go to school, get a degree, learn the craft, or even understand best practices. You don't even need to read my book, Influence. All you need is a phone and an opinion, and you've got your own broadcast media channel in your hands. So go the gatekeepers, as those gatekeepers should go. However, I feel at some point down the road we're going to realize, like we always have in hindsight, that we need some kind of gatekeepers or some things. We just need a filter to be wary of which gatekeepers we choose or which are chosen for us. Either way, radio had its day. Satellite might survive, but it was never and will never be on the same playing field as broadcast. It's network versus cable. You can't compare apples to apple pie. Cable and satellite didn't have the boundaries broadcast did. And even those boundaries are meaningless today in the age of everybody TV. Radio didn't realize that the thing that would have made them truly distinctive was the thing they watered down, the talent. Radio should have been the home for the best personalities who could relate to their audience. Maybe some of them played songs sometimes. But instead, radio made the music the star because it was cheaper than paying entertainers. So today, those entertainers will never even give radio a chance, terrestrial, satellite, or internet. Unless it's their own internet radio. Today, those up-and-coming talent aren't up-and-coming through broadcasting. They're on TikTok, Insta, Facebook, or Snapchat, gaming on Twitch, or wherever the latest focus is on social media. It's never been easier to just do the thing you've always wanted to do. Before, it was those gatekeepers stopping you from that huge audience that radio would offer. Today, those gatekeepers are as irrelevant as the radio stations they keep, and realizing the truth is their audience isn't at all what they make it out to be. And moreover, you can build your own audience literally anywhere else. It was always going to end this way, where tech put the power back into the people's hands. However, terrestrial radio could have stood tall as the proud grandfather of that revolution, rather than the irrelevant, obnoxious has-been second cousin. Radio could have seen it through and set the standard for the way we communicate on the mass platform of social media. Radio could have been along for the ride and still hanging in better than they are, coasting along behind the relevance roller coaster, hanging on for dear life like Marty McFly on a skateboard. Instead, follow me on TikTok, Instagram, Spotify, Amazon, iTunes, Facebook, Threads, YouTube, and literally everywhere else but radio. And if you're still in or were and trying to figure out how to transition to some other platform, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. There's always a place for us, all of us. Maybe one day again, it might even be radio, if they learn their lessons. Coming up, in 2022, I was asked to deliver a speech before Capitol Hill on gun violence. This speech was part of a filibuster of Americans detailing our experiences with gun violence and how it's impacted our lives. It was hard to watch, as I did waiting for my time and after my slot was finished, hearing the pain and agony, the senselessness in these stories of real people expressing real pain over a very real and solvable problem. I was raised by a problematic toxic narcissist in an area and culture where human life wasn't always revered. The obsession over guns and ammo, war, firefights, gun culture, it all speaks to a sociopathic disconnect and narcissistic Neanderthalism of caveman compromises on our foundational values. The ideas of protection against others and a corrupt government, and our misunderstanding of the origins of the Second Amendment are just the tip of the iceberg. In the next episode, I'll deliver the speech I gave before Capitol Hill in my director's cut version. I trimmed it down so I wouldn't monologue, and I realized after I probably should have kept some in. The next episode is difficult for me to discuss publicly because it's raw, revealing, and savage, not in a cool slang way. I'm going to tell you a story that might scare you because it scared me a lot as a kid. I will detail for the first time ever the training, grooming, indoctrination, and abuse I suffered as a young man where guns were concerned. The next episode will be difficult for you too, because so many of our emotions are directly tied to the topic of guns, gun violence, and ideas of protection, freedom, and patriotism. I will be discussing some difficult truths about guns, less statistics because those speak for themselves, but more the ethical concerns on this subject and a cost-benefit analysis. Chances are most of us have lost someone to gun violence. All of us have lost someone to gun culture. I'll deliver my speech for Capitol Hill like you've never heard it before. I'll expand on that. I'll discuss the science behind gun obsession, the mental health aspects of gun culture. And we cannot discuss guns in America without absolutely dismantling the NRA, which I will in the next episode, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, the Compassion and Critical Thinking Workbook, is on Amazon. My new book for social media, Overthinking Everything About Social Media, is on Amazon as well. Influenced by Josh Brandon. Link to them at joshbrandonmedia.com. Check out all my other videos on YouTube, my original music, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting, voiceover work. It's all in playlists for you. You can check out my merch store at my website as well. Get your trigger tees, get your bumper stickers. They make great gifts for that person in your life that, needs a message sent the hard way. TikTok, everywhere else, find me on social media. Subscribe to my channel here if you like what you see. And if you do, consider a donation to Cash App. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. If you'd love to support me, you can support me by purchasing my books, my music, my merch. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.